Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman, and the most important political and legal and geopolitical topic of this day, of course, is the bombing of Iran that the president undertook Saturday night, which was after we taped this podcast roundtable. As you'll hear in the roundtable, a lot of pretty trenchant speculation about what might happen if the bomb were to drop, and I think it's all pretty germane, but I didn't want to just ignore that thunderous fact that has now potential historic importance and could give rise to any of a series of outcomes from rosy to cataclysmic. And to talk about that and especially talk about the law of war and where Trump characteristically ran roughshod over the Constitution, very happy to welcome a good friend of the podcast, but also of Substack, whom you know and have read there, Rich Bernstein, who is a longtime semi-retired now, one of these guys who in retirement works more than before, Supreme Court advocate, sophisticated sense of the courts, and also has written an essay on war powers and what Trump has done that is in our Substack as well to check out. So a kind of long-winded welcome. Thank you so much for being here, Rich Bernstein.
Great to be here. Wish we were here with the war at peace rather than with the world at war.
Yeah. And look, I'll stipulate that, there are ways in which, I think people wouldn't disagree. It could be a very good thing for Iran not to have the capacity to make nuclear weapons. For now, I want to talk about the law. And of course, this all fits in with other themes of authoritarianism that Trump is undertaking back home. And this could really give him tailwinds for, and that's a grave worry. So you tell us a little bit about your essay and your general thinking about Trump's action on the legal front on Saturday.
The Constitution is crystal clear. Congress has the power to declare war. And this was not an accident. It was a major change from the way things worked in England prior to the Revolution. The king had the prerogative to make war. This is laid out nicely in a Scalia opinion in 2015. And the framers decided, we don't want that. English kings would make war like getting up and going to breakfast. And lots of English people died. Lots of English people were bankrupted,
including kings.
Right? Exactly. Lots of English people were bankrupted, paying the taxes for that, etc. So our Constitution gives the power to declare war to Congress. And if you think that's by accident, let me read. James Madison is generally thought of as the number one framer. Let me read you something he wrote to Thomas Jefferson in April 1798. The Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrates, that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. It being the Constitution, has accordingly, with studied care, vested the question of war in the legislative. Now, a lot's happened in 227 years since 1798. I'm not saying, and I couldn't say, that Donald Trump is the first president to engage in war without congressional authorization, to cite just two others: Obama bombing Libya and Clinton bombing Serbia.
And let me just stop you here, Rich, and ask, because we think about Vietnam and the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and assertions by the administration that there's war, and then there's war, is it or isn't it? But when you bomb Iran or Libya, Afghanistan, as you said, that's war. That's unequivocal under the law of war that we have committed an act of war, correct?
Yes, it's not only under the law of war. Any common sense understanding of bombing a country's military facilities in order to prevent them from one day having a major weapon, in this case, nuclear weapons, and at the same time declaring that if that country retaliates, they'll be held to pay in more attacks. That's war. And the vice president said today, we are at war with Iran's nuclear program.
Okay, but let me keep pushing. You're right, it's commonsensical, but it's also the case that in a legalistic way, certain things that also commonsensically pass for war. There's been a murky legal status, administration arguments. These aren't war, these are just military force. And those, there are ways of trying to cabin some exercise of U.S. military might. That ain't one of them here, right?
Right. I mean, I would distinguish two things. One, when you use the military to go after non-state terrorists, in my view, that's not war. That's law enforcement. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So killing Osama bin Laden was not, in my view, war. It didn't require congressional authorization. The second thing is, from the very beginning, Madison actually said this at the Constitutional Convention, there may be sudden things that arise where a president has to use military force because there's not time to go to Congress. Again, to quote Vice President Vance today, talking to NBC News, Iran may have had a bomb in 6 months. Well, there was time to go to Congress. When COVID hit, laws were passed through Congress very quickly. When the financial crisis hit, TARP was passed through Congress, not the first time, but the second time, still very quickly.
What's the response then to something like this? Trump strategically played it to say you've got 2 weeks and then went right away. Congress leaks like a sieve. Had they waited for authorization, Iran would have known, it would have gone less well. What's the legal answer?
Right, but it might be a situation where had we discovered that Iran had a secret nuclear program and we didn't want Iran to know that we might attack, then you wouldn't go to Congress in order to preserve the secret.
And that would be lawful. That would be lawful.
Yes, I think that would be lawful. I think it would have to be genuine. If it was genuine, it would be lawful and not a pretext. But there was no secret here. I mean, the president has been saying for days that Iran has some nascent potential capacity for nuclear materials and eventually a nuclear bomb, and that therefore, if they didn't agree to give it up, we were going to attack. He could have tried to go to Congress. He could have easily said, look, I'm giving you 2 weeks, Congress. Give me a declaration authorizing this. And remember, Bush 1 went to Congress for the first Gulf War. Bush 2 went to Congress for both Afghanistan and the second Gulf War. So, and got authorizations. It doesn't have to formally be called a declaration of war.
Indeed, that authorization to use military force by Bush is actually still in effect, interestingly, but couldn't possibly cover this.
Yeah, I don't think it covers this, and the president and vice president have not claimed congressional authorization. I mean, I think nor have they claimed that they didn't have time to go to Congress, nor have they claimed that there was some secret would be divulged if they went to Congress. Yeah. And by the way, in going to Congress, and this happened with respect to both Gulf Wars, if there are particular things that you want to show to Congress as a president to justify your position, and you don't want the potential enemy to know that the nuclear material is in room A rather than room B, you can have a closed session. But there was no attempt to go to Congress at all. I'm not saying President Trump is the first president to do this. I'm saying the exact opposite. The destruction of separation of powers when it comes to the war power has been a bipartisan operation. And it is you could argue, there are lots of arguments for having a system of government where there is no separation of powers, where one person, like a prime minister, effectively makes all the important governmental decisions. That's not our system. That's not our system. I mean, this will be developed more in the Substack piece, but that was a very deliberate choice not to make it our system. And we have, and the judiciary is fully complicit in this, essentially written the war power clause out of the Constitution. Presidents go to war without going to Congress. And that is dangerous. Every time, first of all, the whole idea of going to Congress, and the reason it's required in the Constitution, is it requires more deliberation, more people, a greater consensus. Terrible things can happen in a war. Americans can die. Innocent civilians can die. There are long-term consequences. People talk in 2025 about the long-term consequences of World War I and the Civil War, much less the two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and Vietnam, and virtually every war I can think of has long-term consequences. And if deliberation is possible with Congress, and it was here, that's what our system requires. And I'm particularly worried because you're conditioning the American people to believe that the military is the personal tool of the president of the United States, and that a president of the United States can do with the military whatever that president wants. That's not true under the Constitution for war, and it's certainly not true under the Constitution for using the military here at home.
Okay, so bingo. And that's what I want to say, because you're right about these precedents, but they now occur under a time of true, clear, and present danger and abuse of the military, and just a promiscuous use of it that now cuts right home to, Iran. No nuclear bombs, Middle East, very important things. But now we're back here living the life we've been living and will be for a few weeks and I mean for a few years, and have to say really soberly, what is the impact? And I think in addition, we can say that the design, as you've sketched it, Rich, for deliberation and back and forth, the likelihood that happened with what we know about the president, I think, is slim.
I assume there was deliberation within the executive branch, but what the Constitution requires is deliberation in Congress.
Yeah, but I'll take it further. I think it's quite possible that there was talking in the executive branch, but that the sort of lizard brain of the president made a decision having to do with very personal, am I winning kinds of considerations that have no place either in international or domestic.
As you know, I happen to agree with you, but let's suppose we had the best president ever. Let's suppose George Washington was president. George Washington, in his farewell address, said, if we get rid of separation of powers, we're doomed. George Washington said, if we get rid of separation of powers, that doing so is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed.
And all stipulated. Well, there's no doubt about your position and of its, historical moorings and its accuracy. I know that's what you're saying, and I'm not disputing it, but I want, because of our, current month-to-month work, to really say there's something especially pernicious, worrisome, of concern with this president in this moment doing this. All right, let me ask you, Rich. So there'll be some talk. We know in the past, this may be the case with the authorization to use military force in 2001. There was after force had already been initiated, kind of ratification. Now, you've made it clear the Constitution calls for authorization. What is the status of a post hoc approval insofar as the principles you're relying on go?
It's a good question, and I believe an example of that was the Mexican-American War. And look, my view is it should be beforehand. It says declare war, but certainly afterwards would be better. It would be good for the president to go to Congress now and say, bless this. I wouldn't hold my breath waiting for that to happen.
Yeah, well, I think that's right. He doesn't want to acknowledge that he may need to do it, even though it's obviously prudent. And of course, things could go, even with the best president, they could go really dramatically south. And that's part of what a pre-mortem kind of thoughtful consideration of these decisions entails.
Yeah, and not to sing, I do believe that the destruction of separation of powers with respect to the war power has been a bipartisan, multi-year, multi-branch operation. And unquestionably, the Clinton administration took the position with respect to bombing Serbia that they did not have to go to Congress before or after, and they didn't.
Well, they took the position it wasn't war, correct?
I can't remember if they took the position it wasn't war. Obama took the position that bombing Libya was not war.
Yeah. Let me just ask you then. I mean, we've talked about authorization, but you just said declare. They would not have had to, if they were doing it right, George Washington style, have gotten Congress to declare war against Iran in advance. It would have been Congress could have authorized the president to undertake war, and that would be kosher under the War Powers Clause?
In my view, yes, and that's happened many times in our history. The number of authorizations of military force from Congress are greater than formal declarations of war. Our last formal declaration of war, my understanding was World War II.
Right, not even Korea. Rich, is always super illuminating to get your learning. It sounds like, I know this isn't why you've written it, but it sounds like if you had to predict on just what happens in the legal landscape and the problem here, it would be something like nothing at all. It just sort of
100% nothing at all. The federal judiciary is as complicit as anyone in the destruction of Congress's power over war. The federal judiciary has used two tactics called standing and the political question. Every time somebody challenges that a president needs congressional authorization to go to war, the judiciary has said, we're not going to touch that. And that's exactly what would happen here. It's what happened, by the way, when Clinton bombed Serbia. The D.C. Circuit said, a bunch of, I think, 26 congressmen filed a lawsuit, and the D.C. Circuit said, we're not going to touch that.
And by the way, I'll just mention that domestically, again, in what he's doing in Los Angeles, the administration position is the precise same. You can't even look at that. And the Ninth Circuit has most recently gone in that direction. All right.
Well, but the Ninth Circuit said you could look at it. God forbid the same thing that's happened with the war power would happen with the domestic use of the military. There's lots of authority that the courts can and should restrain domestic use of the military when it is not authorized by Congress. It's a different story when we're bombing a foreign country.
And that is really a pristine segue to our podcast for today, which I now bring you, hopefully, with this added context of the way the world has changed legally, politically, geopolitically since Saturday. As always, Rich, thanks very much. Everyone look to Rich's and my joint Substack article in the Talking Feds Substack, which will be up at about noon on Monday. Always a pleasure, Rich. Thank you.
Always. Thanks.
Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion on the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. As the world kept anxious watch on the escalating conflict in the Middle East, Donald Trump opened the week by wielding U.S. military might, not abroad, but in Los Angeles. With barely a pretext that the situation had spiraled out of control, Trump stormed in, overriding the objections of the California governor and other state officials to federalize the National Guard in support of his administration's aggressive effort to arrest and deport undocumented immigrants in the city of Angels. And he didn't stop there. Trump pledged to replicate his California incursion in blue states across the country, particularly in big cities he derides as the, quote, core of the Democrat power center, where he claims Democrats, quote, use immigrants to expand their voter base, cheat in elections, and rob good-paying jobs and benefits from hardworking American citizens. He deployed federal force and exerted the weight of the federal government in other intimidating ways to pressure blue states while soft pedaling or bypassing entirely red ones. But it's not just the heavy-handed intrusion of federal troops that alarms. It's the normalization of a military presence on American streets, a scene ripped straight from the authoritarian playbook. And all the while, back in the Middle East, Trump prevaricated. He swung wildly, demanding that Iran, pummeled by Israeli airstrikes, surrender unconditionally, then retreating to a vague, quintessentially Trumpian 2-week deadline to bring Iran to the negotiating table. That equivocation ended abruptly Saturday night, the day after we taped this podcast, with nary a mention to the main stakeholders in Congress. Trump took to Truth Social to declare that the U.S. had launched a, quote, successful bombing of 3 nuclear facilities in Iran. Within hours, Iran launched retaliatory missile strikes on Tel Aviv and Haifa, escalating the conflict. Trump, flanked by his national security team, warned that future strikes, quote, would be far greater unless Iran returned to the table, signaling yet another full-throttle escalation and fueling unrest that now stretches from domestic crackdowns in Los Angeles to the uranium tunnels beneath the Iranian mountains. To assess the legal, political, and geopolitical implications of the administration's use and threat of force, from California to Tehran, we've brought together 3 of the sharpest and most seasoned commentators in the country. And they are Jason Kander, the president of National Expansion at Veterans Community Project. After serving the Army in Afghanistan, Jason was elected to the Missouri State Legislature and later became Missouri Secretary of State in 2012. He hosts the podcast Majority 54, and we covered his book, Invisible Storm, A Soldier's Memoir of Politics and PTSD, in a Talking Books episode. Jason, thank you for your service, and thanks for rejoining Talking Feds.
Always good to be here.
Norm Ornstein, a political scientist, co-host of the podcast Words Matter. He's also a prolific author and co-wrote the bestseller One Nation After Trump. I'll just today go with et cetera, et cetera. Norm, thank you so much for coming back to Talking Feds.
Also a pleasure, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay. And another returning stalwart, Jacob Weisberg, the executive chair and co-founder of Pushkin Industries. He was previously CEO of the Slate Group, co-founder of Panoply, and editor-in-chief of Slate Magazine. He's the author of several books, and he serves as chair of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Jacob, welcome, as always.
Thanks, Harry. Glad to be back.
All right, let's start in a place we normally don't, which is halfway across the world. Trump seems to be all over the place on Iran, but at least the latest pulse check suggests he is now leaning toward military intervention. Just starting with his own self-centered motivations and political calculations, where, of course, he always starts. What's the lay of the land as you see it now that the Israeli almost week-long bombardment has left Iran on the ropes?
I'll start. My thesis is, first, that Trump figures that there are 2 outcomes here. One is that he could behave like General Jack D. Ripper, who many of us remember from Dr. Strangelove. I'm the madman, you can't trust anything, I would bomb Tehran back into the Stone Age, and that would scare the Iranians enough, it would bring them to the table, he could cut a deal, and there would finally be his Nobel Peace Prize. The problem is, if that did not work or does not work, and Trump then does nothing, he looks weak. It's another taco episode. So I think under those circumstances, we get the B-2 bomber and the bunker-busting bombs going in, which for him means nothing. It's not costly. We're not sending in soldiers. He's not going to face a defeat, although it's very unlikely that it will have the entire impact that he wants. But I'd add one caveat, Harry, which is I could easily see the Iranians who are now talking to the Europeans knowing that Trump is desperate to get a deal so that it's all me instead of Bibi, cutting a deal that's even worse than the joint agreement under Obama and leaving Bibi in a very bad place. So we could get, one of those two outcomes, but the deal cutting could be pretty farcical before we're done.
Let me ask you guys, because taco means, that he talks tough. He said 2 weeks, but then caves. But you're suggesting that if the Iranians flex their muscles back and it's existential for them, here comes the B-2 bomber. And, this is a time maybe unique in many years where they probably are relatively exposed and defenseless. But why not just turn tail and do nothing as he's done in the past?
Well, I think this could be the anti-taco in the sense that, through what we understood about Trump's foreign policy is no more wars in the Middle East. But this one might just seem kind of appealing in the moment. I mean, in a normal world, we have foreign policy with strategy that's been developed over a long time and a group of people who are going to work through a decision like this. In Trump world, it seems like it'll be a reaction to what Tucker Carlson says next week. And that's what's so alarming about it. I mean, personally, I'm not sure what I think Trump should do or what I would do. I think there's a strong argument on both sides, and there's obviously risk to acting. On the other hand, the prospect of getting rid of Iran's nuclear project once and for all seems pretty appealing. I think, like a lot of people, I'd think, well, if we could do that without facing ongoing consequences or being drawn into a Middle East war, that would be great. Who knows if we can? But I really feel like Trump is, he's going to flip a coin, and that's what scares me.
At best. I mean, it might be how he's feeling that day. But now, Jason, you said in your tweet, a lot of people are suddenly in favor of war with Iran. So it had been almost an article of faith of MAGA and others. No Middle East engagements. On the other hand, as Jacob says, I think the contemplation here is, a sortie of a couple days that maybe gets the job done. But why do you think so many people are either suddenly quiet or even bellicose?
What frightens me the most about what I'm hearing is some of it is what's coming from Trump. Like the elevation of the rhetoric to where last week he just posted unconditional surrender.
Right.
I mean, the goal creep, I won't even say mission creep, but the goal creep that happens when you manage everything, not as a policy consideration, but as a how is it going to play and how would we talk about it if it were a movie trailer sort of thinking that he has.
Yeah.
And that worries me a lot. And then when I see, people who were cheerleaders for the Iraq war, like Lindsey Graham saying we'll defeat them quite easily and that sort of thing. Well, what do you mean when you say defeat is the kind of question that I have, because a lot of the same people, the Ted Cruz's, those folks are still hanging around who still believe that all you need is air superiority and maybe a few dudes in black pajamas and special forces, and all of a sudden you win wars. And that's not how you win wars, and that's certainly not how you get unconditional surrender. So what scares me the most about the situation is that, as you said, one of the governing sort of principles, if there are some, of MAGA world is that they're isolationist in a lot of ways. But if now we're going to a place where we're making an article of faith that, Iran stands in our way, we're going to get in there, we're going to attack Iran, and we're going to get this regime change, because they're talking about regime change. All I know is you don't get regime change by just dropping bombs. And if you do, you don't know what you're going to get. And that makes me very worried.
Yeah, that second principle is really significant. And we'll stipulate, by the way, we're not privy to all the considerations that ought to inform this decision. Of course, it's far from clear that Trump is paying attention to them. It looks maybe like Pete Hegseth and Tulsi Gabbard are kind of out of the picture in the decision-making, that maybe whatever passes as grown-ups in the Trump administration are coming to the fore. Is that right? And is that reassuring?
Well, I think, when he went into the Situation Room, it looked like his advisors were Larry, Curly, Moe, and Shemp.
And Zeppo. Oh, no, that's the wrong brothers. Yeah, but okay.
Moe and Shemp have left the building. But I had a question for Jason, and that's partly whether there is, in fact, as the Times has suggested, I'm not sure that he's relying on some grown-ups. My understanding, Jason, is that these 30,000-pound bunker-busting bombs are not precision weapons. You drop them, and it's not like you can pick a hole that they're going to go down into and are going to burrow down in just the right place that you need. And then you have to follow with a second one after the first one sort of opens it up because they're burrowed so deep down. If that's the case, then it's not like even you can go in with complete air superiority, send the B-2 over the nuclear site, and maybe your bomb ends up 25 miles away from it and does a huge amount of damage, but it has nothing to do with Fort No. Am I right about that, or what's the bottom line there?
Yeah, well, let me begin by saying I was in the Army, so my knowledge about, stuff like bunker busting bomb, that it's more Air Force side. So yeah, but in general, yeah, there's precision and there's precision. Particularly with how precise can you be with a bomb that is built to destroy things underground? It's pretty hard to say like, we'll only get the things that we need to get. But also, I just look at this as like, okay, if we're going to creep into regime change territory, the only time in history, to my knowledge, where you just flew over and dropped bombs until people decided to do exactly what you wanted was the 1986 movie Iron Eagle starring Louis Gossett Jr. Great movie, not particularly realistic. And so that's my problem with it is like, if we're going to keep this regime change, wouldn't it be better if we had a different, like, you end up Iraq 2.0, but in Iran. That's what worries me, is if we're going to talk about it that way, that's where you end up getting to eventually.
Yes and no. I'll just go back to Jacob's point. Well, first I'll go back to my point, which is we don't know what we're talking about exactly. There are other countries in the Middle East that had sort of flirtations with nuclear weapons. They lost them and they haven't revived them. So if it's really the case that you drop one bomb and get lucky and where you're actually done with this specter of Iranian nuclear weapons, regime change, no regime change, that would be pretty huge. But there's a lot of ifs there, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm saying what startles me is this rhetoric. You see it now on Fox News. You see Ted Cruz talking about it. You see Tom Cotton. You see Lindsey Graham. They're all talking like what's going to happen is we're going to have a Jeffersonian democracy in Iran. Right. And it's like, I've seen this movie before. And at one point in Afghanistan, I was an extra in this film. And so I'm concerned about that kind of stuff. And also, frankly, to Norm's point, like, no, you don't guarantee that you take out any nascent nuclear program by dropping these. You make your odds higher, but you don't guarantee it. And what you do is you do start a war. That definitely is the thing. Like if we're going to drop bombs in Iran, we are at war with Iran, and that comes with a whole other set of considerations.
Regime change has a bad name for good reason, and anybody who talks about it at this point is thinking so ahistorically that it's kind of hard to imagine they're kind of paying attention. What doesn't have a bad name is containment, and the idea that Iran has been a bad actor in the region, has supported these terrorist groups around the Middle East, face serious setbacks, and we may be in a position to deal another setback to Iran's aggression. An Iran that didn't try to dominate Syria and Lebanon and support terrorism around the Middle East is an Iran we could live with, a non-nuclear Iran. And to me, that's the reasonable goal worth contemplating risk in exchange for.
Let's return to the domestic political scene then, because the way you say it, Jacob, sounds kind of sensible and, dare I say, grown up. Now, there is a schism developing, and certain important figures in MAGA world like Steve Bannon and Marjorie Taylor Greene. But what's your sense if he goes ahead of how serious a rupture he creates with his base and if he's really even thinking in those terms?
Look, I think they'll follow him to the ends of the earth. I think that, the base is a kind of fanatic base. I think, they're capable of bleeding a little bit along the way, whether it's about some people about Ukraine, some people about the budget. We've gotten to the point where they're little peeps of protest, but they're not things that in any way constrain or impede him. They're just little kind of rhetorical flourishes. And it's hard for me to imagine at this point any part of his base actually deserting him or opposing him on an action like this. I think they'll
You
say,
think he has free reign?
yeah, they'll say, we didn't like that, but we love him.
All right, Mr. Congress, that would be Norm Ornstein, of course. There is this one pushback a little bit by Ro Khanna, and mainly Dems, really, with Massey there. Maybe you see it in the Senate with a Rand Paul. But, it's been pretty tepid, right, the pushback in Congress. How do you analyze that, and how do you book it as this 2-week clock ticks?
Tepid is too nice. This is a cult, Harry. And the Republican leaders in Congress are full-fledged lieutenants or generals in the cult. I'd say lieutenants because they basically take orders from Trump and his other minions. In a normal world, what you would see now as we get this tough talk about what could end up being a very bad war, you would have members of Congress on both sides saying, this is a decision for Congress to make. We need a resolution. They're not even concerned about that. They are not going to do anything. And we've seen this on every front. They simply are not challenging Trump's authority or promoting their own. We used to have a substantial amount of what we could call institutional patriotism in Congress, this sense that we are important, we're the first branch, we matter here, push back when presidents exceeded their authority. You're not getting that from any Republican.
So you don't see that breaking a little bit even on this issue. Do you see the War Powers resolution passing? And do you think anybody gives a fig in the administration about it?
I don't think they're going to be able to bring up a resolution, and Republicans would fear that it would not pass, although you're going to have a significant number of Democrats who would vote for authorizing Trump to use force against Iran.
Yeah.
But I think they're just going to leave it for him to decide. And the only way I could see any pushback is if this really went south quickly. If we had a catastrophe on our hands.
Oh, we go forward and it's a total mess.
And it's a mess. And whether it means that we, end up killing huge numbers of civilians with no good outcome, or being drawn into a larger war. And that could include, as we know, the Iranians deciding that they're going to put mines into the Straits of Hormuz and basically bring a large share of the oil and gas trade to a halt for a period of time, which would bring economic chaos, including at home. My guess is that somebody around Trump has raised that as a possibility, which he would view as really awful, and they might react against that. But you start with an understanding that it's a cult and they're all in on the cult.
Okay, here's what I'm hearing as a sort of closeout on this from everyone. So speak up if I've got this wrong. Trump has freedom of movement, whatever the hell that means with him, and maybe there's a taco factor, maybe there isn't, but what he, wants to do goes. Because there've been a lot of reports, here's MAGA kind of fraying, here's Bannon and Marjorie Taylor Greene. But I'm hearing a consensus from you political savants that, actually, this is like everything else. He'll have his way. Maybe he'll screw it up royally, but he'll have his way. Does anyone dissent from that view?
No, not really. I mean, because to me, the stuff that's happening beneath the Bannon versus whoever, those are just skirmishes. Those are just skirmishes that happen all the time. And look, in 2024, what happened was you had a bit of a revolution. And after revolutions, you have people involved in the revolution jockeying for who's going to get to be in charge of what. That's just what happens. And so they're always fighting over this stuff. Remember with Musk and Bannon? It's just like, hey, who's going to get the attention of the benefactor today? And the only people who go outside of that are the people who have their own benefactor or their own constituency. Rand Paul gets to go outside of that because he's inherited from his father a long-time different constituency for Republican politics. Tucker Carlson right now gets to go outside of it because he likes to make videos from Russian grocery stores and tell us how great they are and go on Russian television all the time. And my good bet is that if he were on Fox News, he wouldn't be asking those questions of Ted Cruz that he did the other day. But he's not on Fox News anymore, and he went and he got a new person for his paycheck, and I'm pretty sure it's Putin. And as a result, like, a bunch of progressives sit there and watch him and go, oh, look, it's fraying in the Republican base.
Right,
no, it's
right.
not. It's Iran and Russia are tight, and he's doing the bidding of his benefactor. And so I just think these are all below the surface skirmishes that don't amount to much in the eventual outcome.
Jason, I don't know where your number is. I say let's talk when his approval rating hits 34%. I mean, I think there's a number at which Republicans start to desert him based on self-interest, but they have to be more afraid of losing a general election than they do of being primaried. I mean, it's district by district, but right now I think they're applying a political calculation, and they don't see the risk to hanging on with Trump.
What's sad is I'm not sure that the number's going to matter at all until after the midterms. I think that they live out of far too much fear to do anything against him until his number is 1, because until they get past a potential primary, until they get past all those things, and look, if they don't have their base in the general, they're not going to win. And there's just not that many seats in Congress that are up in terms of a general election. I mean, they're most, with the exception of the Senate, the majority of those seats still come down to primaries. But the reason I think that it might matter after the midterms is because they would like to hang on to the presidency. And if you look at the tepid statement that J.D. Vance made the other day about this, which was just, the president has earned our trust in him making a decision, in him choosing. That was J.D. Vance saying, like, I would like to not own how this goes in 3 years, please.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I do think that may change things a bit, but I don't see them deserting him at all in the next few months because he will turn on them, and that's worse.
But don't you think there are swing districts like the one I'm in here in the Hudson Valley? Our congressman is Mike Lawler, and this is a seat that's gone back and forth. He's not at risk from a primary. He's at risk in the general election. But if he's too pro-Trump and walking that line, if it becomes impossible, it may be politically advantageous for him to come out against Trump, even vote against him.
I think that's a good point, and here's how I think that's going to go. I think that because there's a limited number of those seats, I think that there will be an expectation by party leadership that those people will have to do that, and Trump will be talked down from attacking them. 100 years ago when I was in the state legislature, we had rural Democrats back then who we all understood they weren't going to be able to vote the way we wanted them to vote all the time, and nobody gave them grief because we needed to hang on to those seats. There are a few seats in Congress like that, and I think you can expect that no matter what Trump's numbers are from them. That's their job.
I would give you just a slightly different interpretation. There's little doubt that they'll find ways to enable a Mike Lawler to look like he's independent again. And frankly, they can count on a whole lot of the mainstream press to call him a moderate when he's anything but a moderate. But this isn't just about either a primary challenge or even a general election challenge. There are two other elements to this. I'll go back to it being a cult. The fear of being shunned or excommunicated. The idea that all your friends and your relatives and the people around you view you as an apostate is a very powerful thing for a lot of these people. And that's why you saw even people who weren't worried about re-election or getting another job, like Rob Portman, after he announced he was retiring, didn't change anything. He wasn't going to go back to Cincinnati and have everybody shun him. And now we have another element to this, which is the physical fear. The fear that Trump will single you out. And frankly, the assassinations in Minnesota make that worse. There is a palpable belief that you could unleash some Trumpy lunatics out there to go after you or your family. We know that Bill Cassidy, when he said, I could not tolerate RFK Jr. as the Secretary of HHS, yeah, there was a primary challenge, but it was the threats to his family and himself that changed him. So maybe you're right, Jacob, that there's a certain point, 34%, 24%, probably less, where people don't fear being shunned because they've already seen a substantial number of the Trump voters say, well, this guy is not doing everything the way we wanted him to. But we're far from that point now.
I think it's worth anathematizing the fear a little more because the political fear and what you describe as that fear of social ostracism are fairly normal. It's the physical fear that is not normal in American politics. And it has a very specific quality, which is that Trump whips up a digital mob, a mob in social media, a troll mob, and that there's spillover from that into physical threat. And everyone in politics, I think, feels this to some degree now. But all three kinds of fear are still present when someone's making a political decision. Now, if you're feeling physical fear, maybe that's predominant and overwhelms everything else. But it's the intersection of all those things that's kind of keeping the coalition in line.
Okay, so 2 quick points, and then let's move stateside. The first I want to say is come on, are they really afraid? And sounds far-fetched. I'm here to say I've talked to legislative members of Congress who have priced out full-time security. That's not something that's, part of the congressional benefit package. It's really expensive. They can't afford it, but just that they're pricing it out, it's true. They think in those terms, they are exposed in public all the time. And then the second thing I wanted to say from my lawyer's standpoint is the one poll that most buoys me from the last week or whatever is, I think it's NBC poll saying 80+%, including half of MAGA, say if a court opinion comes down, he needs to obey it. And for me, and keeping an eye on, are we going to lose the whole republic? That is the most encouraging.
I was just going to say that in general, on the topic of when will Trump's influence begin to wane, I just go back to feeling like that clock doesn't start ticking until after the midterms, because that's when he starts to become a lame duck.
If he does, right?
Yeah. And I still believe that where we are heading historically, long term, and the way politicians 10, 20 years from now will, and I've said this before, but we'll talk about Trump. I think the analogy is the way they talk about the war in Iraq, which is it's just a thing that happened and we can't seem to find anybody who was for it. And I do believe we will start to see that sometime in the second half of this second term when they're looking for a new person to go onto the stage. And they're also, honestly, at that point, going to be looking for every opportunity to politely push him off the stage because they don't like living under this environment. It's just what they have to do.
Which is one of the reasons I think that he, brandishes sabers about maybe running again, et cetera.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that's why.
All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. Today's spirited debate asks, to decant or not to decant? That is the question. And the short answer is yes. But when should you decant? First off, what is it? Decanting is the process of slowly pouring liquid, in this case wine, from one container to another without disturbing the sediment at the bottom. It is important to separate the wine from the sediment if there is a lot of it, because the sediment can dampen the aromas and flavors in your glass. Decanting wine also helps the wine to aerate, which is the process of introducing oxygen to the liquid. No doubt you've heard or even said the phrase, let the wine breathe. Well, that's what decanting does best, allowing those aromas to expand while making the wine more flavorful and balanced. And it's never a bad idea to decant a young, bold wine. In fact, at Total Wine & More, our guides recommend allowing an hour or two for the process to work best. This is not advisable for mature wines that just need to be separated from their sediment. Leaving a mature wine in a decanter for too long could cause flavors to become muted from too much aeration. Remember to taste your wine while decanting, to be sure it is not left aerating for too long. And don't forget, the younger and more closed the flavors are when you open the wine, the more it will benefit from the decanting process. Even a few seconds of aeration or a quick swirl in your glass will do wonders to your favorite wine from Total Wine & More. However, the best rule of thumb is, whenever you can, decant. Taste and enjoy when it feels best to you. It's personal. Cheers.
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine and More for today's A Spirited Debate. Let's move to the domestic landscape, among other reasons, because I think we have a better hold on what's going on. But you have this federal show of force in California. Just let me quickly report, before we came on, the district court judge, Judge Breyer, held a hearing, even though the Ninth Circuit has put a hold on his previous order for a stay. But things are different now on the ground. There's the prospect that maybe we're moving to really mainline Posse Comitatus Act territory with, there's been at least one arrest by one Marine. In any event, my opinion is that the Ninth Circuit ruling pretty much gives him a green light to do the same kind of thing in other cities. He would take it if it were a yellow light, but that he's going to take that green light, and that for sort of political reasons mainly, California's not going to fight hard. So I don't see where it goes from here to, en banc review or the Supreme Court. But let me serve that up to you. After that Ninth Circuit ruling, should we just expect, as he said in that, even for him, extraordinarily vicious social media tweet, LA replayed in Chicago, New York, and other places sort of indefinitely over the next few months?
Yes, because if you recall, during the transition, and when they started talking about how they were going to do this mass deportation policy, they were trial ballooning the idea of using the military. And they saw that that was unpopular. And they realized we can't come out of the gate and just start using the military to conduct these deportations and to conduct these raids. So they were using ICE, supported by other law enforcement, particularly federal law enforcement.
Weren't invoking the Insurrection Act, right?
Right. But their plan all along was to use the military to do this. And so while others look at what happened with him using the military in LA as, it being strictly political and a move to continue the characterization of American cities as these dangerous places run by Democrats, I think that's all an element of it. But what I saw was a Gulf of Tonkin situation. He wanted to use the military in the first place to conduct immigration raids, and public opinion didn't allow him to do it. So he manufactured a situation where it appeared his hand was forced. And I think that's where we are.
You're nodding, Norm. So let me come to you direct, because you've had a few tweets, as have you, Jason, just talking about the corrosive effect of, boots on the ground in cities, that it becomes somehow normal or shrugged off the way it would be in real authoritarian society. So you're really worried about the kind of social implications above and beyond the kind of law enforcement ones. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah. And I will say I was a little surprised by the Ninth Circuit ruling. It was 2 Trump judges and 1 judge nominated by a Democratic president. And it struck me because, you have Trump invoking an emergency to do this when there's no emergency. And why you'd have a court give him the authority to basically, first, to bring out the National Guard when the governor has not asked.
Quite to the contrary, as governor said, do not do this, please. We got things for them to do, like put out fires.
And then bring in the military. I always feared that after the immunity decision, that this Supreme Court, which seems firmly in the unitary executive camp, is basically going to give the president unlimited authority to decide what an emergency is. And one thing we know more broadly is that there are dozens and dozens of congressional actions giving unbelievable authority to a president to seize the communications networks, to seize the transportation networks, if the president, declares an emergency, all based on the assumption that a president's going to obey the Constitution and isn't going to do this unless there is a genuine, deep emergency. No assumption that we would have a president like this one. So that's one part of it. The second part that really worries me, and here we have another element to this, and what Trump said about aid going to California, when he said, well, it's hard for me to give money to somebody who doesn't like me because of the criticism of Newsom. And we know that we have a different president here. We know it from his first term when he tried to take money away from California for fires. We know that ICE is basically going all over blue states and blue cities in red states, that this is a political cudgel, and that he is going to use his authority otherwise to punish blue states and cities. What I worry about for the midterms, Jason, is that he is going to find all kinds of ways to tilt the elections to turn us into Hungary. But using the military in this fashion, threatening to invoke the Insurrection Act, making sure right at the beginning of his term that he would have a joke as the Secretary of Defense and would remove any leaders in the Joint Chiefs or top officials in the military who would push back against bad actions and unconstitutional acts on his part. All of this, as Jason said, was foretold. And maybe it took a couple of months longer than we might have expected, but we've seen just the bare beginning of this, and I'm scared to death of where this takes us.
I think you're right to be, Norm. It doesn't look like the courts are going to stop him. I don't like this decision either, but I think Harry's read on it is right. I think what does potentially exercise some constraint is the political risk of turning his favorite winning issue, immigration, into a losing issue. And there are a few ways he's touched on the possibility of doing that. The biggest one is just through sheer cruelty, which doesn't, it's breaking up families, deporting people who are beloved in their communities. It doesn't play well. But I think the militarization also presents its own risk, and the danger to business presents a risk. The American economy is heavily dependent on people who are here without legal status, who, for the most part, work and pay Social Security and are contributing members of society, but aren't here legally. If you were to really deport everybody, or even deport numbers, in excess of what previous administrations have deported, which I should say Trump has not to date, you threaten a real economic disruption. And any of those could turn Trump's winning hand into a losing hand. Now, from the Democratic point of view, they have the opposite problem in a way. How can they turn what's been mostly a losing issue for themselves into a potentially winning issue? And the trick for Democrats and liberals is, how do you take a strong stand in favor of legal immigration, which I think works, but without saying, actually, we're okay with the illegal immigrants who are here? I mean, the answer, of course, is the kind of, immigration reform, the kind of compromise that didn't happen under either President George W. Bush or Obama, but somehow regularizing the status of people who are here, but then enforcing the law on immigration in a much more consistent fashion, is I think how Democrats have to play it. A lot of Democratic politicians, especially in California and New York and other blue states and in blue cities, have a really hard time saying they don't like illegal immigration, because they recognize that illegal immigrants are a significant component of the societies they lead.
Not to depress us even further, but I will tell you the other thing that worries me about all this, which is that Trump is using this to strengthen his hand at politicizing the military. And, we did a thing on my show where we looked at the speech he gave at All You Need in Qatar, like in mid-May, where he basically tried to give a Trump rally speech in front of a crowd of airmen and airwomen. And, they were professional and they didn't really respond because they knew that this is not appropriate. And then he deploys the Guard and some Marines into the streets of Los Angeles, and he goes to Fort Bragg. And at Fort Bragg, they triaged, which this is unprecedented, they triaged who was going to be in the audience, and they sold MAGA merch, and they said, only go stand behind the president if you're for his politics. They treat it like a rally. And then what he did is he started talking about the same partisan stuff, the leftists, all these terrible people in LA who are now confronting our troops. And he messed with the audience and made it, your enemy is the left, because now I have created an image where American service members are opposite people who disagree with me politically. And that worries me a lot, because the American military is not built to be manipulated politically or used politically, but he seems to have found a way to make it easier for his future illegal or unethical orders to be carried out, not just by the Fox News hosts and idiots who he's put at the very top, but by the professionals who are down the chain. And that scares me a lot.
Yeah, I think there are two separate things going on. One is, you're right, I was struck, no less an absolutist than Tom Homan is starting to talk about, we'll try to focus on criminals. So far, fewer than 10% of the people they've seized have had any kind of outstanding criminal record. They're also actually giving breaks within red America and certain industries that are being ravaged. But I agree with you, Jason, they just got an independent instinct, zeal, obsession that he can't stop of just hammering and humiliating blue America. So if he can use this power to demonize and vilify, I mean, it is so spectacularly anti-presidential, right? And what we want, but he's literally exploiting this power and going as far as the court will permit him to exactly go back to the campaign and why, Democrats and Democratic cities are completely overrun by criminals and the like. One quick point on the Ninth Circuit. So I agree with, I think both Jacob and Norm have expressed reservations about the opinion. The opinion's pretty mealy. And what it really seems to say is, on the one hand, good thing, this is where Newsom has tried to sort of snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. You don't get a full ride, Mr. President. But on the other, we have to defer more. That's how Breyer messed up. And we are talking about a situation that by any objective measure is light years from the kinds of circumstances that have authorized federal military intervention in the past. So it really does seem to me, if this isn't fought hard, and I don't think it will be, it only takes a few episodes, I think, for Trump to use it as a pretext for going in and with a fair measure of assurance that the courts won't stop him. And yes, that's a recipe to me for, what looks like kind of boots on the ground or the equivalent throughout the country. That's, startling and terrifying.
I'll add a button for that, which is that I think it's pretty clear that a president who decided to have a military parade for his birthday is probably not going to get bored by deploying American troops against people who disagree with him politically.
Button accepted. There you have it. All right, look, I just want to broaden a little because he's taken this pretext with military use, but this theme, and you guys have touched on it some. I actually wrote about it this week of not just exploiting military power, but really there's a whole agenda in there somewhere in the, catacombs of Project 2025 elves to really continually deploy executive power to make war on blue America, it seems to me. Do we have enough anecdotes here to make the case? We've got the charging and investigation of Democrats and only Democratic officials. We have what I said, that he's easing up on immigration in red states. We have his jumping to take control of the case in Minnesota. We have his absolutely trashing Minnesota folks rather than doing what a president's supposed to do. We have these physical arrests, pretty violent arrests, again, only of Democrats, like most recently Brad Lander. Do we have a solid argument that here's a guy who's using executive power at every turn to harm, intimidate, oppress, and just generally make life more difficult for blue states, qua states, not just officials?
Harry, I thought your New Republic piece about this was very good. It's so shocking. I mean, he's not behaving like a president. He's behaving like a warlord. The first thing a president says when he's elected is, "I'm the president of the whole country." The first thing you do is try to unify the country. And, Republicans especially have this, what's been a politically very healthy tradition of trying to bring people around. I mean, the old cliche, the Republicans look for converts and the Democrats look for heretics. So I have to think the silver lining here is it's a really stupid thing to do. First of all, there are lots of Republican voters in blue states. who in many cases are going to be harmed by the policies he's pursuing. It's vengeance or pure antagonism against, it's the neutron bomb. I mean, you can't just hit the governor, you hit the state. And so he's kind of giving up the hope, maybe, of bringing further states over to the Republican side. Now he's not running again; he won't be on the ballot again, inshallah. So maybe he's not bound by that concern. It's an expression of his persona, of how he acts, of what he's like. He can't stop himself, but I don't think that means it makes any sense.
What worries me about it is the ability of the rest of the Republican infrastructure around him to use this politically to do what they have done so well over the last many years, which is to present people who are not Republican as culturally and fundamentally different than you. And I live here in Kansas City, and I think about when you go outside the city and you go into any suburban or rural area, really exurban or rural area, there are Democrats there. What there are not are Democratic yard signs. There are not those things because a really strong message has been sent for many, many years now that those people don't live here. And that's not who we are. It's a brand identification thing. And I feel like this is an extension of that. People think of gerrymandering as just gerrymandering, but gerrymandering has also been an attempt, as a friend of mine once said, to make the minority party the party of minorities, so that white folks look at, the elected leadership in their state legislature and say, well, none of them look like me. I guess that's not me. And so when you think about the way he's doing this and targeting cities, targeting mostly people of color, I feel like he has this choir behind him that can try to make it sound like it's the same sheet of music. Yeah, there should be empathy for these people, but they don't look like me. They don't sound like me. I don't know people like that. That's, by all forms of logic, this should be a really dumb way to do politics. And I worry that there are going to be enough people invested in the future of the Republican Party to try and put it in that they're not like us frame.
And arguably, it's the only way they retain power. At least that's the lesson many have learned.
I mean, I think there are two elements to this. One is Trump's sociopathy, narcissistic sociopathy, is such that if you didn't vote for me, I'm going to stick it to you. And if you don't praise me, I want nothing to do with you. And of course, it's also, if you give me tons of money, then I'll do anything you want. I tweeted today that if Iran put up a Trump hotel, casino, and golf course in Tehran, then Khomeini would be his BFF. And we've seen other countries now that are putting up Trump properties in return for lower tariffs. We've got all of that. But there's another element to this, which I think, follows on what both Jason and Jacob have said, which is you put all of his policies together. And who's being screwed over more than anybody else? His voters. It's the working class and rural voters who are going to be screwed by all of this. And this fits, I think, a couple of other components here. One is Trump saying in 2017, I could shoot somebody in broad daylight on Fifth Avenue and I wouldn't lose a single vote. And it is, I can do anything I want to them and they'll come groveling back to me, in part because I've got a communications network that'll blame it on Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Gavin Newsom and all of those Democrats, in part because it's a cult and he knows that they're going to stick with him. Now, there's a little nervousness. If you've noticed, when they put up these Medicaid proposals that we know will require the closing of hundreds of rural hospitals, and this isn't his doing, all of a sudden Republicans in Congress are saying, well, we need a fund. We need a separate fund to protect the rural hospitals. The people who are losing Medicaid and the families, fuck them, but the rural hospitals. But their voters are going to be hurt by all of this. Their voters are hurt by tariffs. They're the ones who are hurt the most. It's working class and poorer Americans who are going to end up paying more for everything that's a part of their necessities. And I believe that these guys think that not only can they convince people that there's nothing really wrong here, as Trump always says, it's all great. Look, the prices have come down dramatically. Tell people something that they know is ridiculous, but you can convince them otherwise. And that he can manipulate the process, blaming the other side and using voter suppression techniques to still prevail. And of course, what they get out of it is more money for the billionaires, which means more money for them and more money for their campaigns to do just what I'm talking about. And look, the fact is it's working so far.
Yeah, I'll just say this, and maybe here's an end. I may be a little more jaundiced or pessimistic than Jason. I'm older after all. I think the attitude you say about some kind of sense of the other and maybe kind of latent or just more prevalent than we think, but that's where national leadership comes in, either to push things more for understanding, unity, which, by the way, has the economic upsides that Norm is talking about, we're now missing. But he has, from day one, from the walk down the escalator, decided to bet it all on the exact opposite, to inflame, to both not just justify, but really aggravate the feelings of division and otherness, or so it seems to me. All right, we only have a minute left for our much-loved feature of 5 words or fewer, where we take a question each of us has to answer in 5 words or fewer. This takes up on Norm's tweet, because, you've mentioned just the corrosive effects of having these pretty fearsome dudes coming into our cities, the ICE agents and stuff. They're masked, for starters. So the question is, what is the next fashion accessory for the ICE agents? 5 words or fewer, gentlemen, please.
Gold sneakers.
Christy Gnome's dog's dog tag.
Brass knuckles and a noose.
There you go with 5. Yeah, and this isn't much next to you guys, but gold-plated body armor. Thank you so much, Jason, Norm, and Jacob. And thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts. And please take a moment to rate and review this show. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. Check us out on Substack now, at Talking Fed Substack, where I am posting 2 or 3 bulletins a week, going live and sharing other exclusive content that breaks down the various threats to constitutional norms and the rule of law. You can follow us on Twitter at Talking Feds Pod. Talking Feds remains a completely independent production, so it's your support and nothing else that funds all of our franchises. We just couldn't do it without you. And as you may know, Talking Feds has now joined forces with The Contrarian. I'm a founding contributor to this new media venture, which is committed to reviving the diversity of opinion that feels increasingly rare in today's news landscape, where legacy media seems to be tacking toward Trump for business reasons rather than editorial ones. Rest assured, we are still the same scrappy independent podcast you've come to know and trust, but now linked up with an ambitious and vital project designed for this pivotal moment in our nation's legal and political discourses. Find out more at contrarian.substack.com. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the Feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Catherine Devine. Our associate producer is Becca Havian. Sound engineering by Matt McCardle. Rosie Don Griffin, David Lieberman, Hamza Mahadrenathan, Emma Maynard, and Hallie Necker are our contributing writers, and production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu and Sebastian Navarro. Our music, as ever, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.